starred sky, and I can remember a tear running down my frozen cheek, a tear neither of pain nor of joy, but of emotion created by intense experience. By the time I got back to the billet, the officers had put an end to the celebrations and ordered the bonfire extinguished. Hals had saved a half bottle of schnapps for me. I swallowed down a few mouthfuls, not to disappoint him. 4 more days went by. The hard cold continued, embellished by snow-filled squalls. We went out only for obligatory duties, which we reduced to the minimum, and burned tons of wood. The houses had been built to conserve heat, and we were sometimes even too hot. We felt very well, and as is usual under such circumstances, we very soon had some trouble. Ours began one morning, sometime around 3 o'clock. A guard noisily kicked open the door of the hut, admitting a blast of icy air, and 2 soldiers whose stiff, bluish faces made them look remarkably alike. They rushed to our stove, and it was a few minutes before they spoke. Along with everybody else, I shouted at them to shut the door. In reply, we received a curse and were ordered to stand at attention. As we gaped, somewhat startled and without reaction, the fellow who had shouted kicked over the bench standing next to him and, shouting out his order a second time, hurled himself at the improvised bed of one of our men, violently ripping apart the mound of blankets, coats, and jackets in which our comrade had buried himself. In the dim light of the stove, we recognized the epaulets of a Feldwebel. "Are you bastards going to get the hell up?" he shouted, pulling out everybody he could reach. "Who's at the head of this bunch? It's a disgrace. Do you think this is how we'll stop the Russian offensive? If you're not ready in 10 minutes, I'll throw you out of here just the way you are." Stupid with sleep and stunned by our sudden awakening, we hurriedly collected our things. Leaving the door wide open, the Feldwebel rushed from our butt, like a madman, to inject panic into the Isba across the way. We had no very clear idea of what was happening. Our sentry, who seemed quite shaken, told us that the intruders had arrived from Minsk in a sidecar. Those 15-odd miles must have taken them quite a long time, which would explain their furious condition. But, despite all the demonic howling the Feldwebel could muster, it was a full 20 minutes before we were standing at attention in the snow. Lauis, who had been as deeply asleep as anyone else, tried to shock us into wakefulness, with a pretense of rage as intense as his colleagues. The other Feldwebel, whose anger had not abated, barked out our orders. "You will join Commandant Ultraner's unit at Minsk before dawn." He turned to Laus. "You will take 15 trucks from the depot and proceed as I've ordered." Why hadn't he telephoned, instead of working himself into such a state? We found out later that, while we had been sleeping peacefully, the telephone line had been cut in 4 places. The difficulty of getting underway and bringing the trucks out from the depot was almost unimaginable. We had to roll out barrels of gasoline and alcohol to fill the gas tanks and radiators, crank up the engines in exhausting labor, and shovel out cubic yards of snow, almost entirely without light. When the 15 trucks were ready, we set out for Minsk, following the bumpy, snow-covered track the Feldwebel had taken to reach us. One of the trucks skidded on the icy ground, and it took a good half-hour to pull it from the ditch. We hooked it to another truck, which could only skate along the ice. In the end, almost the entire company was involved in the struggle, and we literally carried the damn machine back onto the road. Toward 8 o'clock in the morning, well before the late winter dawn of those regions, we joined Ultraner and his regiment, and stood shivering, despite our exertions, in a vast city square with 2,000 or 3,000 other soldiers. Minsk seemed to be bursting with excitement and energy. A network of loudspeakers which had been set up throughout the square disseminated a short lecture from the High Command. The lecture pointed out that even a victorious army had to accept deaths and casualties, and that our role as a convoy unit was to carry, at whatever the cost, and despite all the hardships, which the High Command thoroughly recognized, the food, munitions, and materiel the combat troops required. Our convoy, by any means available, had to reach the banks of the Volga so that von Paulus could continue to wage his victorious battle. 1,000 miles separated us from our destination, and we hadn't a moment to spare. We left after the midday meal. I found myself separated from my closest friends aboard a 5.5-ton DKW loaded with heavy automatic weapons. The road leaving the city was well plowed, and we rolled along at a brisk pace. There must have been road gangs working around the clock. The snowbanks on either side of the road were nearly 12 feet high. We passed a signpost bristling with pointers. On the sign indicating the road we took, I read Nak Pripyat, Kiev, Dnieper, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk. Our troops had rounded up everyone capable of holding a shovel, and we were able to cover nearly 100 miles in good time. We soon reached the summit of a hill, from which we could see the immensity of the Ukraine, stretching into the distance under a yellowish-gray sky. The 10 or 12 vehicles ahead of us had suffered a serious reduction in speed. Ahead of them, a company of soldiers were busily engaged in moving snow. A heavy truck was pushing a sled fitted with a kind of ventilator, which blew out the snow in all directions. Beyond lay an infinity of immaculate snow, nearly 3 feet deep. Heavy snowfalls buried the road so completely after the passage of each convoy that we needed a compass to dig it out again. Our commanding officer and his non-coms had walked a short distance out onto the upswept snow, sinking in over the tops of their boots, and were scanning the horizon, wondering how they could possibly proceed through all that soggy cotton. Inside our DKW, with all the windows shut, I and my traveling companion were relishing the warmth of our running engine. But soon, they were ordering us out of our machines and distributing snow shovels. As there weren't enough to go round, our non-coms told us to use anything we could lay our hands on. I saw men digging with boards, helmets, big serving platters. With 2 other fellows, I was pushing against the tailgate of a truck which we had detached, hoping to use it as a crude sort of snowplow. The blast of a Feldwebel's whistle interrupted our disorganized labor. "What do you think you're proving over there? Come along with me. We'll go and round up some manpower. Bring your guns." I felt a surge of jubilation, which I kept well hidden, as I inwardly thanked the idiots who had devised our hopeless procedure. I preferred almost anything to shoveling snow. We followed the Feldwebel. I had no idea where he hoped to find more manpower. We had only passed 2 deserted villages since leaving Minsk. With our guns slung, our little group split off from the track the trucks had traced in the snow and headed north. We sank in over our knees with every step, which made progress extremely difficult. For 10 minutes I did my best to follow the Feldwebel, who was about 15 feet ahead of me. I was gasping for breath, and I could feel the sweat beginning to trickle down my spine under the heavy cloth of my coat. My breath projected long streams of vapor, which vanished instantly in the icy air. I kept my eyes glued to the Feldwebel's deep footprints, trying to step exactly into them, but as he was bigger than I, this meant that every step was a leap. I deliberately avoided looking at the horizon, which seemed so far away. A thin screen of birches soon hid the convoy from us. Ludicrous in our smallness, we continued forward into the immensity of white. I was beginning to wonder where our non-com thought he would find his famous manpower. We had been exhausting ourselves in this way for nearly an hour. Suddenly, in the absolute quiet, we heard a rumbling sound, which was growing steadily louder. We stopped. Our sergeant limited himself to the observation that we hadn't much further to go, and then added that it was a pity we would miss this one. I didn't really understand what he was talking about, but the noise was becoming increasingly clear. To our left, I caught sight of a black line stretching across the snow. A train. We were 22, approaching a railway line. I still didn't see what a train could do for us. Would they take our cargoes on board? The train was going by very slowly, about 500 yards ahead of us. It was extremely long, a line of black broken at intervals by one of the 5 locomotives, spewing out impressive clouds of white vapor, which vanished almost instantly, as if by magic. The train must have had a special mechanism for snow disposal. 15 minutes later, we reached the tracks. A lot of supply trains go through here, the Feldwebel said. Most of the cars carry materiel, but there are usually a few passenger cars for Russian civilians. We'll stop one of them and collect some Russian labor. Finally, I understood. All we had to do now was wait. We tramped briskly up and down the tracks, trying to keep warm. However, it felt as if the temperature had risen somewhat, as if by now it might be up to 15 degrees, which indicates the astonishing degree to which we had grown accustomed to 0 temperatures. The cold, as we waited for the next train, seemed quite bearable. Soldiers wearing only pullovers were shoveling snow and streaming with sweat. I have never met anyone better able to stand punishment, whether from cold or heat or anything else, than the Germans. Each Russian I saw was more frozen than the last, but I certainly could not feel superior on that account. Life in Russia for me was a perpetual shivering fit. The first train passed by without even slowing down. Our Feldwebel, who had outdone himself in his efforts to stop it, was furious. Soldiers shouted to us from the train that their orders were not to stop for any reason whatever. Extremely irritated, we walked on in the direction of the train which had passed us. At all events, the road must be parallel to the tracks. We would only have to make a right-angle turn to find our company again. The difficulty was that we were far from the kitchen, and the hour for the distribution of food must have come and gone. I had 2 pieces of rye bread in my coat pocket, but I didn't want to take them out for fear of having to share them. The 2 soldiers with whom I had been shoveling snow must have known each other for some time. They were deep in conversation and had stuck together ever since we'd left the convoy. Our non-com was walking ahead of us, by himself, and I tried to catch up with him. By now we had been walking for some time. The tracks were sunk between 2 banks, which supported a thin growth of scrubby brush. They extended straight ahead into an indefinite distance. If a train came along, we would be able to see it for at least 5 miles. The scrub on the banks at this point was growing more thickly and extending a greater distance from the tracks. It was now some 3 hours since we had left our company. Everything stood out clearly against the snow. For some moments now I had been staring at a black shape about 500 yards away. 10 minutes later, we could see that it was a hut. Our Feldwebel was walking toward it. It must be a shelter for railway workers. The Feldwebel raised his voice. "Hurry up. We'll wait in that shelter over there." It didn't seem a bad idea. We had regrouped, and a young fellow covered with freckles, one of my snow-shoveling companions, was joking with his friend. We were making our way toward the butte when a violent burst of sound struck my ears. At the same moment, I saw, to the right of the hut, a light puff of white smoke. Utterly astounded, I looked around at my companions. The Feldwebel had flung himself down on the ground like a goalie onto a ball and was loading his automatic. The fellow with the freckles was staggering toward me with enormous eyes and a curious, stupefied expression. When he was about 6 feet from me, he fell to his knees. His mouth opened as if he wanted to shout, but no sound came, and he toppled over backward. A second barrage of sound ripped the air, followed by a modulated whistle. 23. Without thinking, I threw myself flat on the snow. The Feldwebel's automatic crackled, and I saw some snow from the roof of the butte shoot up into the air. I couldn't take my eyes off the freckled young soldier, whose motionless body lay a few yards away. "Cover me, you idiots!" the Feldwebel shouted, as he jumped up and ran forward. I looked at the freckled soldier's friend. He seemed more surprised than frightened. Calmly, we aimed our weapons toward the woods, from which a few shots still rang out, and began to fire. The detonation of my Mauser restored some of my confidence, but I was still very scared. 2 more bullets whistled in my ears. Our sergeant, with appalling self-assurance, stood up and threw a grenade. The air rang with the noise of the explosion, and one of the worm-eaten planks of the butt disintegrated. With incomprehensible calm, I continued to stare at the cabin. The Feldwebel's automatic was still firing. Without panic, I slid another bullet into the barrel of my gun. As I was about to shoot, two black figures ran from the ruins of the hut and headed toward the forest. It was a perfect opportunity. My gun sight stood out clearly in black against the white of the countryside, and then merged into the darkness of one of the galloping figures. I pressed the trigger and missed. Our chief had run as far as the hut, firing after the fleeing men without hitting them. After a moment, he signaled us to join him, and we extricated ourselves from our holes in the snow. The Feldwebel was staring at something in the ruins of the cabin. As we drew closer, we could see a man leaning against the wall. His face, half covered by a wild, shaggy beard, was turned toward us. His eyes looked damp. He gazed at us without a word. His clothes, of skin and fur, were not a military uniform. My eye was caught by his left hand. It was soaked with blood. More blood was running from his collar. I felt a twinge of unease for him. The Feldwebel's voice brought me back to reality. "Partisan!" he shouted. "Hain, you know what you're going to get." He pointed his gun at the Russian, who seemed frightened and rolled farther back into the corner. I too recoiled, but our non-com was already putting his automatic back in its holster. "You take care of him," he ordered, waving toward the wounded man. We carried the partisan outside. He groaned and said something unintelligible. The sound of an approaching train was growing steadily louder. This one, however, was returning to the rear. We managed to stop it. 3 soldiers wrapped in heavy reindeer skin coats jumped from the first carriage. One of them was a lieutenant, and we snapped to attention. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he barked. "Why did you stop us?" Our non-com explained that we were looking for labor. "This train is carrying only the wounded and dying," the lieutenant said. "If we had some troops on leave, I'd help you out. As it is, I can't do anything for you." "We've got 2 wounded men," the sergeant ventured. The lieutenant was already walking over to the freckled soldier, who was lying motionless where he had fallen. "You can see that this one's dead." "No, mein Leutnant, he's still breathing." "Ah, well, maybe. But another 15 minutes, he gestured vaguely. "Well, all right, we'll take him." He whistled at 2 skeletal stretcher-bearers, who lifted our young comrade. I thought I could see a brown stain in the middle of his back, but I wasn't sure whether it was blood mixed with the green of his coat, or something else. "And the other one?" the lieutenant asked impatiently. "Over there, beside the hut." The lieutenant looked at the bearded man, who was clearly dying. "Who's this?" "A Russian, mein Leutnant, a partisan. So that's it. Do you really think I'm going to saddle myself with one of those bastards who'll shoot you in the back any time, as if war at the front wasn't enough?" He shouted an order to the 2 soldiers who were with him. They walked over to the unfortunate man lying on the snow, and 2 shots rang out. 24. A short time later, we were making our way back to the road. Our non-com had abandoned the idea of an improvised labor force, and we would now rejoin our unit, which undoubtedly had not made much progress. I had just been under fire for the first time, an experience I can no longer describe with any precision. An element of the absurd was mixed into the day's events. The Feldwebel's footsteps in the snow were so enormous, and I, in my confusion, kept looking for the young freckled soldier who should have been returning with us. Everything had happened so quickly that I hadn't been able to grasp the significance of anything. Nevertheless, 2 human beings had suffered senseless deaths. Ours had not yet celebrated his 18th birthday. It had already been dark for some time when we finally found our company. The night was clear and cold, and the thermometer was dropping with horrifying speed. Despite our forced march of nearly 4 hours, we were shaking with cold and famished. My head was swimming with exhaustion, and frost from my breath lay on the high collar, which I had pulled up almost to my eyes. For some time before we reached it, we were able to see our convoy, standing out clearly, black against white. Its progress had indeed been small. The trucks had sunk in through the icy white crust over the tops of their wheels, and great slabs of snow clung to their tires and mudguards. Almost everyone had taken refuge inside the cabs. After chewing on their meager rations, they had wrapped themselves in everything they could find and were trying to sleep, despite the bitter cold. A short distance away, the two fellows who'd been chosen for guard duty were stamping on their boots, hoping to warm their feet. Inside the cabs, through the frosted glass, I could see an occasional gleam from someone's cigarette or pipe. I climbed into my truck and felt in the darkness for my rucksack and mess tin. When the tin was propped between my icy fingers, I wolfed down a few mouthfuls of some filthy mixture that tasted like frozen soya. It was so bad that I tipped most of it onto the snow and ate something else. Outside, I could hear somebody talking. I craned my neck to see who it was. A small fire had just been kindled in a hole in the snow and was burning with a cheerful brilliance. I jumped down from the truck and hurried as fast as I could toward this source of light, heat, and joy. 3 men were standing beside the fire, among them my Feldwebel of this afternoon. He was breaking pieces of wood across his knee. "I've had enough of this cold. I had pneumonia last winter, and if I get it again, it's goodbye to me. Anyway, our trucks are visible for at least 2 miles, so we're not giving anything away by just lighting a few sticks." "You're right," replied a fellow, who must have been at least 45. "The Russians, partisans or not, are all snug in their beds." "I certainly would be glad to be home in my bed," said another, staring into the flames. We were all practically in the fire, except for the big Feldwebel, who was busily reducing a packing case to fragments. Suddenly, someone shouted at us, "Hey, you over there!" A figure was approaching us between the trucks. We could see the silver trim on his cap, gleaming through the darkness. Already the Feldwebel and the old man were trampling on the fire. The captain came up to us, and we stood at attention. "What do you think you're doing? You must have lost your minds. Don't you know the orders? Since you've come out to watch round the campfire, you can pick up your guns and make a nice patrol of the neighborhood. Your festivities have undoubtedly attracted a few guests. Now it's up to you to find them. By twos until we leave. Understood?" It was the last straw. With death in my soul, I went off to look for my damned gun. I was on the point of collapse from hunger, exhaustion, cold, and God knows what else. I would certainly never have the strength to spend the night slogging through that horrible snow, whose frozen crust covered more than 2 feet of white power, into which I sank over the tops of my boots. I was filled with rage which I, 25, couldn't express. Exhaustion prevented reaction. I returned to my companions in misfortune, as best I could. The Feldwebel decided that the fellow who was pushing 50 and myself should take the first patrol. "We'll relieve you in 2 hours, which will be easier for you." I have never understood why, but I had the distinct impression that the miserable cur had purposely put me with the old man. No doubt he preferred the other fellow as a companion, 25 years old, and strongly built, to a scrawny 17, or an old man. I started off with my fellow sufferer, convinced that we were a vulnerable combination. After the first few steps, I tripped and fell down full length onto the snow, scraping my hands against the hard, icy crust. As I was pulling myself up, I was scarcely able to contain a paroxysm of tears. The old man was a decent sort. He too seemed to have had about enough. "Did you hurt yourself?" he asked, in a paternal tone. "Merde," I replied. He said nothing. Pulling his collar a little higher against his head, he let me get in front of him. I didn't really know where we were supposed to be going, but that was unimportant. What I knew beyond a doubt was that I would double back as soon as the black mass of the convoy was out of sight, and despite my exhaustion, I managed to put a considerable distance between myself and the old man. I moved forward nervously, breathing as little as possible, as the icy air burned my nose. But after a moment I couldn't go on. My knees trembled, and I dissolved in tears. I could no longer grasp anything that was happening to me. I could see clearly in my mind's eye France and my family, and the games I used to play with my friends and my Meccano set. What was I doing here? I can remember crying out between bursts of sobs, "I'm too young to be a soldier." I don't know whether or not my companion was surprised by my confusion. When he caught up with me, he contented himself with saying, "You walk too quickly, young fellow. You must forgive me if I can't keep up with you. I shouldn't even be a soldier. I was retired before the war, but 6 months ago they called me up anyway. They need everyone they can get, you know. Anyway, let's hope we get home again safely." As I didn't understand very much about the times and needed someone to blame, I began to attack the Russians. And all of this on account of those bastards. The first one I meet has had it. However, I wasn't able to forget the events of the afternoon. The partisan and his execution had overwhelmed me. The poor old man looked at me in bewilderment. He must have wondered whether he was involved with a party fanatic. "Yes," he said in a carefully veiled tone. "They're certainly making us sweat. It would be better to let them settle it among themselves. They won't stay Bolshevik for long. And in the end, anyway, it's none of our business. And Stalingrad, we certainly have to supply the Sixth Army. My uncle is there. They must be having a tough time." Of course they're having a tough time. We don't know everything. Finishing off Zhukov isn't going to be easy. Zhukov will quit, the way he did at Kharkov and Zhytomyr. This won't be the first time General von Paulus made him run. He said nothing. As we lived without much information from the advanced front, the conversation came to a halt. I certainly never guessed that the doom of Stalingrad was already sealed, that the soldiers of the Sixth Army had given up hope and were fighting in horrible conditions with heroic tenacity. The sky was covered with stars. In the moonlight, I was able to see the little student's watch strapped on my wrist, a souvenir of my certificat d'études in France. Time seemed to be standing still, and those 2 hours dragged like centuries. We walked slowly, watching the tips, 26 of our boots, sink into the snow with every step. There was no wind, but the cold, which was growing increasingly severe, pierced us through and through. For 2 hours at a time, throughout that accursed night, we shivered in this way. Between each tour of duty, I was able to snatch a brief sleep. The first glimmers of light, which found me shoveling snow, fell on a face creased with exhaustion. With dawn, the cold grew even more intense. The woolen gloves we had been issued were worn through, and our frost-bitten hands were wrapped in rags or in our extra pairs of socks. But in spite of the exercise of shoveling, the cold was no longer bearable. We slapped our hands against our sides and stamped our feet to keep our chilled blood moving. The captain, in a moment of compassion, ordered some ersatz coffee prepared and served to us boiling hot. This was doubly welcome, because for breakfast that morning we had been given nothing but a portion each of frozen white cheese. The corporal at the canteen told us that the thermometer outside his truck read 24 degrees below zero. I don't remember exactly how much longer this journey took. The days which followed have remained in my memory like a frozen nightmare. The temperature varied between 15 and 25 below zero. There was a horrifying day of wind when, despite all of the orders and threats from our officers, we abandoned our shovels and took shelter behind the trucks. On that day, the temperature fell to 35 degrees below zero, and I thought I would surely die. Nothing could warm us. We urinated into our numbed hands to warm them, and, hopefully, to cauterize the gaping cracks in our fingers. 4 of our men, who were seriously ill, suffering from pulmonary and bronchial pneumonia, lay groaning in makeshift beds set up in one of the trucks. There were only 2 medical orderlies for our company, and there wasn't much they could do. In addition to these serious illnesses, there were at least 40 cases of frostbite. Some men had patches of skin on the ends of their noses, which had been frozen and had become infected. Similar infection was common in the folds of the eyelids, around the ears, and particularly on the hands. I myself was not seriously affected, but each movement of my fingers opened and closed deep crevices, which oozed blood. At moments, the pain was so intense that I felt sick at my stomach. At moments, my despair was so intense that I broke down in tears. But as everyone was preoccupied with his own troubles, no one paid much attention. Twice, I went to the canteen truck, which doubled as the infirmary, to have my hands washed in 90-degree alcohol. This produced paroxysms of pain, which made me cry aloud, but afterward, my hands felt warm for a few minutes. Our inadequate diet contributed to our desperation. From Minsk, our point of departure, to Kiev, the first stop, was a distance of about 250 miles. With all the difficulties of the route taken into consideration, the authorities had given us food for 5 days. In fact, we required 8 days, which obliged us to consume some of the rations intended for the front. In addition, we had to abandon 3 of the 38 vehicles in our group because of mechanical failure, destroying them along with their cargoes, so that they wouldn't fall into the hands of the partisans. Of the 4 men who were seriously ill, 2 had died. Many others suffered from frostbite, and a few had to have frozen hands or feet amputated. 3 days before we reached Kiev, we crossed what must once have been the Russian line of defense. We drove for hours through a landscape littered with the carcasses of tanks, trucks, guns, and aircraft, gutted and burned, a scattering of junk which stretched as far as the eye could see. Here and there, crosses or stakes marked the hasty burial of the thousands of German and Russian soldiers who had fallen on this plain. In fact, many more Russians than Germans had been killed. However, insofar as was possible, the soldiers of the Reich were given decent burials, while each Orthodox emblem marked the grave of 10 or 12 Soviet soldiers. Our journey across this boneyard naturally did not make us feel any warmer. The huge shell holes, which we had to fill in as best we could, made it particularly difficult. 27. Finally, our convoy arrived at Kiev. This handsome city had not suffered much damage. The Red Army had tried to stop the Wehrmacht outside the town, in the zone we had passed through. When they had no longer been able to withstand German pressure, they had preferred to withdraw to the other side of the city, to spare it the kind of destruction Minsk had suffered. Kiev was our first stop, halfway between Minsk and Kharkov. Our ultimate destination, Stalingrad, was still more than 600 miles away. Kiev was an important strategic center, where units coming from Poland and Romania regrouped and made ready for the offensive, which would push on to the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea. To an even greater degree than Minsk, the city swarmed with soldiers and military vehicles, with the difference that here there was a perceptible atmosphere of alert. Our group entered the outlying zone of the city and halted until further orders from the Kommandantur. Once again we found ourselves walking on a snow-covered roadway, as slick and firmly packed as a ski run. We thought we had reached the end of our troubles. Everyone was anticipating the arrival of orders, which, we felt certain, would direct us to our new lodgings. We were sent first of all to the hygienic center, which was extremely welcome, as the cold had made even the most cursory washing impossible. We were all disgustingly dirty and covered with vermin. Those with serious injuries were hospitalized, a category to which only 7 men were admitted. For everyone else, the journey continued. We spent only 7 hours in Kiev. As we left the remarkably well-organized sanitary service, our group was ordered to stand at attention on the snow-covered esplanade in front of the building. A Hauptmann arrived at high speed in a Volkswagen. He turned toward us and delivered a short speech without getting out of the car. "Soldiers, Germans, convoy troops. At this hour, when the conquests of the Reich extend across a vast territory, the fatherland depends on you to assure the victory of our arms by your devotion. It is your responsibility to hasten the pace at which essential supplies reach our fighting troops. The hour has come for you to perform your duty on the front you know so well. The road, fraught with 1,000 perils and hardships, upon which you have already expended such prodigious energies. From our factories, where our workers are drawing on all their strength to forge the necessary weapons, through your exhausting journey toward our heroic combatants, no one is allowed a moment's respite so long as any German soldier might suffer from a shortage of weapons, food, or clothing. The nation is drawing on all its strength to ensure that our soldiers at the front receive what they require, and are thus able to retain their enthusiasm and confidence in our solidarity. Not one of us has the right to flinch or falter in the face of momentary discouragement. No one has the right to doubt the heroism daily confirmed by our fresh victories. We all have to bear the same sufferings, and dealing with them as a unified group is the best way of surmounting them. Never forget that the nation owes you everything, and that in return, it expects everything of you, up to and including the supreme sacrifice. You must learn to support suffering without complaint, because you are German. Heil Hitler! Heil Hitler! We answered in unison. The Hauptmann cleared his throat and continued in a less theatrical tone. You will make up a full group and will rejoin the 124th and the 125th at the edge of town, on the Rollbahn to Kharkov. Your formation will be accompanied by a section of motorized combat troops belonging to Panzerdivision Stulpnagel. They will protect your convoy from the terrorists who will try to impede your advance. As you will see, the Reich is making every effort to facilitate your task. He saluted, and his orderly immediately shifted into gear. We joined the 2 other sections of our company at the selected place to form the 19th Company Rollbahn, under Commandant Ultraner. My first thought was that now, I would surely 28 run into my friends from training camp if they hadn't been transferred or killed. I didn't know whether they'd left Minsk before or after us, but in fact our old 19th had been reformed. We now possessed a rolling kitchen which could serve us hot meals. This made a great difference to us. Immediately before our departure, we were served a large hot meal, which produced an almost unbelievable sense of well-being and raised our spirits to a remarkable degree. The cold seemed to have settled at about 4 degrees below zero, which was an improvement. But then we had just taken hot showers and changed our clothes. I had no trouble finding Hall's, whose exuberant gestures I recognized easily. "Well, what do you think of the weather, young one? And of the restaurant, eh? It's 10 days since I've swallowed anything hot. We thought we'd die of cold on that damn train." "You were on a train. If that's not luck." "Luck! You can talk. You should have been there when the locomotive blew up." It made a cloud of steam at least 100 yards high. 4 of the fellows were killed, and 7 wounded. Morvan was wounded while we were cleaning up the mess. It went on like that for 5 days. I was with a patrol that went after some terrorists. We caught 2 of them hiding in a kolkhoz. Collective farm. One of the peasants they'd robbed put us on their trail, and afterward invited us to his place and gave us a regular feast. I wasted no time in telling him my adventures. Talking this way made us both feel better. We had just run into Lenzen and Ollensheim. Our sense of happiness and relief at meeting again was so great that quite spontaneously we grabbed each other by the shoulders and mimed an exaggerated polonaise, shouting with laughter. Some of the older men stared at us in astonishment, unable to see any reason for this burst of gaiety, so inconsistent with the gray and icy atmosphere. "Where's Farstein?" I asked. "Oof," roared Lenzen, still laughing. "He's snug and warm in his truck. He sprained his ankle, and it's so swollen he can't take his boot off, so he's waiting for it to deflate." "He's making the most of it," Hals remarked. "If I carried on like that every time I turned my ankle." Our conversation was interrupted by the order for departure, and we returned to our posts. Knowing that my friends were there, with only a few trucks between us, made me feel a great deal better, and I almost forgot that each turn of the wheels was taking me closer to the front. It was still so far away. We were traveling on bad roads covered with snow and ice. On either side, a wall of snow thrown back by road-clearing operations hid the countryside. Through the occasional gaps, we were able to see traces of the terrible fighting which had overrun this part of the country the year before. The hastily patched road was so rough that we had to crawl through several hundred miles of this ruined countryside. The troops of von Wix, Guderian, von Reichenau, and von Stulpnagel had wrenched this territory from the Soviets after weeks of heavy fighting, and held several hundreds of thousands of prisoners between Kiev and Kharkov. The amount of Russian war materiel strewn about under the snow made me wonder how they could possibly have much left. Rising temperatures brought fresh snowfalls, which made it necessary for us to bring out our shovels again. Fortunately, a section of the armored column which was supposed to accompany us joined us 2 days later. We were able to attach 4 or 5 trucks to the back of a tank so that, with their engines going, the trucks were able to manage a slipping, sliding advance despite the snow and ice. However, the low clouds soon vanished, leaving a pale blue sky. The thermometer plunged sharply, and we were caught once more by a biting cold on that accursed Russian plain. Occasionally, a group of German airplanes would pass over our column with throbbing engines. We waved wildly at the pilots, who responded by dipping their wings. Higher up, squadrons of Ju-52s passed slowly over us, flying east. Our hot meals no longer warmed us, and Frostbite 29 was eating into my hands once again. Fortunately, this time our convoy included a doctor. Each time we stopped to eat, we lined up beside his truck. He coated my hands with a greasy, curative ointment, which I tried to keep on as long as possible, as it reduced the pain in my cracked skin and preserved it from the cold. I kept my hands buried in the depths of my giant overcoat pockets, unless absolutely forced to pull them out, and then I was very careful not to rub off the ointment against the rough cloth. I spent long hours in the cab of a 3.5-ton Renault, jolting from rut to rut. From time to time, we had to remove the snow which accumulated between the mudguard and the tire, or help another machine which had skidded and gotten stuck. Otherwise, we avoided everything which obliged us to step outside. So far, I had escaped guard duty at night. When darkness made further advance impossible, we stopped where we were. The driver had the right to the seat. I usually slept on the floor, with my legs wedged in beside the pedals and my nose on the engine, which gave off a sickening stench of hot oil. We always woke up stiff and numb with cold. Well before daybreak, we began the exhausting struggle of starting our frozen engines. Hals had come to see me several times, but my driver always protested that 3 was too many for our tiny cab. He advised me to go and see my friend instead, but that always came to the same thing, and there was certainly no question of standing outside for a chat. One day, just after we had passed a large town with a Luftwaffe airfield beside it, we were joined by a reconnaissance plane, which entered into radio communication with the Kommandogruppe of the armored section accompanying us. A moment later, the plane left the convoy and veered to the north. The tanks in our column disappeared in whirlwinds of snow thrown up by their treads. We went on as before, without feeling any special anxiety. A few hours later, we heard the booming sound of distant explosions. This stopped, began again a few minutes later, then stopped, then began again. At 11 o'clock, the convoy halted in a village covered with snow. The sun was shining, and its gleam on the snow made us squint. The cold, although intense, was bearable. We walked over to the soup truck, whose 2 stoves were belching smoke. The first arrivals were sent by the cook to fetch the kettles. This cook was not at all a bad sort, and his skill was adequate at least to prevent insurrection. The dishes he prepared really weren't bad at all. The only oddity of his cooking style was that everything without exception was served with the same thick flour sauce. I joined Halls and Lenson, and we were walking back to our trucks, bent over our steaming mess tins. Suddenly, a series of more or less distant explosions shook the icy air. We stopped for a moment and listened. Everyone else seemed to be doing the same thing. The explosions began again. Some of them were obviously far away. Instinctively, we began to hurry. "What's going on?" Lenson asked an older soldier who was climbing into his truck. "Guns, fellows. We're getting closer," he said. We had all guessed this already, but we needed confirmation. "Ha," said Hulse. "I'm going to get my gun." Personally, I didn't take any of this too seriously. There were a few more explosions, some separate and distinct, others overlapping each other. The departure whistle blew, and we climbed back into our trucks. The convoy jolted into motion. An hour later, as we reached the top of a hill, the gunfire brought us to a complete stop. It was coming from much closer. Each explosion literally shook the air, which was a very strange sensation. Some nervous drivers had stepped on their brakes much too quickly. Their trucks had skidded on the ice, and the drivers were racing the engines, trying unsuccessfully to straighten their machines. I had opened our door and was looking down the line of trucks. A Volkswagen was driving from the rear at top speed, and a lieutenant was shouting through its open door, "Hurry up! Get going! Keep moving! You, help that idiot out of the rut!" I jumped down from our Renault and joined a group of soldiers trying to pull an Opel Blitz back onto the road. The firing had begun again. It seemed to be quite close and coming from the 30 north. Slowly, and with difficulty, the convoy began to move. As we had jammed on our brakes in the middle of an ascent, my driver had a particularly hard time starting up our truck. We descended slowly into a rolling, wooded countryside. The dull sound of explosions continued. Suddenly, the trucks at the head of the column stopped again, and we heard the blast of a whistle. We quickly jumped to the ground. Soldiers were running to the head of the convoy. What was happening? The lieutenant of a while ago was running too, collecting a group of soldiers as he went by. I was one of them. Carrying our Mausers and running as fast as we could, we reached the front of the column. The big Kommandogruppe half-track seemed to have driven deliberately into the thick snow at the side of the road. "Partisans up ahead," a Feldwebel shouted. "Scatter for defense." He pointed to our left. Without understanding very much, I followed the sergeant who was at the head of our group of 15 soldiers and plunged into the snowy slope. As I pulled myself up on the white barrier, I could see very clearly a swarming mass of black figures emerging from a stunted woods and proceeding at right angles to our line of march. The Russians seemed to be moving as slowly as we were. The cold and the weight of our clothes combined to deprive this spectacle of the animation of westerns or of American so-called war films. The cold made everything sluggish, both gaiety and sadness, courage and fear. Ducking my head like everyone else, I moved forward, paying more attention to the position of my boots than to the movements of the enemy. The partisans were still too far away for me to see them in any detail. I imagined that, like us, they must be making huge strides to avoid disappearing in a hole in the snow. "Dig your foxholes," the Feldwebel ordered, lowering his voice, as if the other side could hear us. I didn't have a shovel, but scraped away some snow with the butt of my rifle. Once I was crouched in this relative shelter, I was able to observe the scene at leisure. I was astounded by the number of men coming out of the woods opposite. There were so many of them, and I could see still others in the forest itself, through the branches of the leafless trees. They looked like ants swarming through tall grass. They were obviously moving from north to south. As we were moving east to west, I couldn't grasp their intention. Perhaps they were going to try to encircle us. Our troops had just set up a heavy machine gun battery on the slope nearest us, about 20 yards away. I didn't understand why there had not yet been any exchange of fire. The enemy had begun to cross the road, about 200 yards from us. The sound of big guns from the north was louder than ever, and there seemed to be some answering fire directly opposite us. My hands and feet were beginning to feel the cold. I didn't understand our situation, and felt entirely calm. The band of Russians crossed the road without bothering us. They appeared to outnumber us by 3 or 4 to 1. Our convoy consisted of 100 trucks with 100 armed drivers, and 60 accompanying troops whose sole function was defense. In addition, there were 10 officers and non-coms, a doctor, and 2 medical orderlies. Each explosion created clouds of powdered snow. From the wooded hill in the near distance, plumes of smoke, synchronized with the increasingly frequent sounds of explosion, rose into the air. The heavy machine gun to my right burst into sound for a moment, and then fell silent. Stupidly, instead of crouching down in my hole, I lifted my head. I could see little white clouds puffing out among the numerous silhouettes of the partisans. There was a sound of dry detonation, with an answer in kind from the Russians. My eardrums had begun to feel as though they would burst from the noise of the machine gun, which was joined by another on the slope opposite. Everywhere, soldiers were firing their Mausers. Over in the Russian sector, the black silhouettes were running in all directions, faster and faster, through the puffs of white smoke. Some of them fell and lay motionless. The sun,